And if the world had stayed covered in tropical forest, then it's possible that birds, rather than mammals, would have remained in charge. But while predatory birds ruled the roost on land, some mammals found escape in the most unlikely place for a furry, four-legged creature: the water. Here they started to grow very, very big indeed, eventually leading to the largest animals ever, the whales. Whales are proof of the amazing adaptability of mammals. But how these 150-ton beasts evolved from small tree-dwelling creatures has been one of the greatest scientific mysteries. For over a century, scientists have been scouring the Earth for fossils of the original ancestors of whales on land. In the 1920s, an intrepid American called Roy Chapman Andrews led a huge expedition to Mongolia to discover fossils. One of his most spectacular finds was the skull of a large hoofed carnivore. Close examination of its teeth revealed surprising similarities between them and those of whales. It turned out to be a distant relative.
It's extraordinary when you look at a living whale or a dolphin and realize that at one time its ancestor was a land-living creature which would have looked something like a pig or a giant dog or something like that. But over the years, of course, the skeleton and the skull and the teeth of mammals can adapt and does adapt and has adapted quite rapidly.
No one knows what prompted hoofed carnivores to take the plunge and eventually become swift swimmers. In fact, nearly all mammals can swim. It's just that most would rather not. But by studying living animals, it is just possible to work out how mammals could have made this remarkable transition. And as it happens, the world's expert on swimming mammals is Dr. Frank Fish. He believes he's uncovered how an ancient landlubber could become an expert swimmer.
If we look at this dog paddling, what you can see is all four of the limbs stroking the water in an alternate fashion. But what a dog paddle really represents is sort of a trot that the animal is doing while it's in the water. It isn't a very efficient gait.
A mammal that is equally at home in the water and on land is the otter. Otters seem to represent what a missing link between whales and land mammals might look like, making them a fascinating animal to study, even if they're not always cooperative. Dr. Fish is trying to record their unique swimming action on a special slow-motion camera.
Great.
In the lab, he has discovered there are a few simple changes in swimming style that enable a land mammal to swim more like a seal and less like a dog.
What we find is instead of using all four legs, the otter is instead using just its hind legs. Its front legs are tucked up underneath it, and the hind legs then are paddling simultaneously.
The otters are not just running in the water, they are using their back feet together to act as a paddle and allowing their spine to flex up and down, driving them forward. it's a much more efficient stroke.
Otters represent a transitional stage, something intermediate between both land and water. And because of that, they're really of interest because they probably represent, at least in a modern form, what the ancestors of animals like dolphins may have been like.
But otters are modern animals. No one had ever found an otter-like ancestor to the whales, a missing link between land and sea. Then, in 1992, at a remote dig site in Pakistan, paleontologists discovered a remarkable set of bones. They seemed to assemble a creature made up of an assortment of parts, one that could live on land and in the water. Its discovery was a triumph for scientists. It was the elusive missing link. It was called Ambulocetus, which appropriately means walking whale.
When I first saw an Ambulocetus skeleton, the bones were robust. They remind you of semi-aquatic animals such as otters. Ambulocetus probably moved somewhat like otters today. It had expanded limbs in terms of its hands and feet, which were probably webbed, so it could develop thrust in a paddling manner. It also had a robust tail and probably was starting, like otters, to use the tail motion to produce thrust.
Ambulocetus was a creature totally new to science, and Dr. Fisher's work helped the Walking with Beasts team to make it move, both on land and in the water. But Ambulocetus wasn't the end of the whale's tale. After all, it was an animal still tied to land. It didn't explain how whales became larger and truly aquatic. This was the next stage in the story. It's the last place on Earth you'd expect to find anything to do with water. But here in the Sahara Desert, there is evidence that some underwater creatures once lived here. It's a place that has intrigued marine paleontologist Dr. Mark Ewan.
40 million years ago, this whole area was covered with a vast ocean that we call the Tethys Sea. It extended from the North Atlantic across the Mediterranean and covering much of North Africa and northern India. And the water would have come in here not just covering the valleys, but covering even the highest peaks. And all the layers that you see here were once the ocean bottom. You can see evidence for that all over the place here. Here's an oyster shell, here's a snail, and I even found a shark tooth. These are all things you just don't expect to find in the desert.
Something else you don't expect to find are giant whales. When skeletons like these were first discovered in the 19th century, they were thought to be the remains of huge sea serpents. They were named Basilosaurus, which means king lizard. But Basilosaurus was no giant lizard. It has a mouthful of unmistakably mammalian teeth.
This is the snout of the animal, and this is the roof of the mouth. And these are the incisors. These are the front teeth, here, here, and here. And as you get further back, you see the teeth have two roots. You see two here, and two here. Basilosaurus has actually very few teeth compared to modern toothed whales, and has the number of teeth much more like primitive mammals. They use their front teeth to grab onto prey, and then they use their back teeth to chew their food, unlike modern toothed whales which swallow their food whole.
This area in Egypt was named Valley of the Whales because the desert floor is littered with the remains of Basilosaurus. These creatures were giant predators, but they weren't quite like modern whales yet. Their bodies were long and snake-like, and they still had some primitive characteristics that linked them back to their ancestors on land.
These are the back legs of Basilosaurus. You can see here the pelvis, the femur, the kneecap, the lower leg, and the foot, which even has little toes on it. These tiny hind legs weren't attached to the backbone, and their small size shows us that they couldn't support the body weight on land. So if they weren't used for walking, what could they have been used for? Well, one idea is they were used as sexual claspers, that the male and female used them to hook up during mating and hold on while they mated.
At 18 meters long, Basilosaurus was probably the largest animal on Earth at that time. It presented a real challenge for the scientists and special effects artists to make it work properly. The scale model had to be shrunk to fit, and it still took 4 people to control it.
Giving a feeling of sort of sinister. Ooh, spooky.
And working out how to get an extinct animal to swim was a combination of artistic skill and scientific advice.
So how would you like to see these back legs or?
They are back
They are
legs.
essentially back legs, right.
I'd like to see them, if the joints will do it,
Yeah.
like just trailing, pointing absolutely straight back.
Just right. Okay, yeah, sure.
Like the feet of an otter, for example.
Right, okay. Yeah, sure thing.
Now at last, the story can be told of how hoofed carnivores evolved webbed feet and started to swim. Eventually their backbones loosened, their legs got smaller, and their tails turned into flukes. The mystery of how a group of mammals conquered the water was complete. Whales represented the mammals' first attempts to get truly enormous. But land mammals were not far behind, and they got their chance once the climate turned against the rainforests. Life on Earth came under the influence of one continent, Antarctica. Over millions of years, the other continents moved away, leaving it isolated over the South Pole. Gradually, the continent became colder and colder until a permanent ice cap formed. This triggered a change in the world's climate. It meant a drop in global rainfall. Rainforests shrank, making way for new habitats.
There were all sorts of changes going on. Climates were changing worldwide. It was getting somewhat cooler, and there was the beginnings of the retreat of the forests as those climates changed, and animals were creeping out and going onto the plain.
All this change played into the hands of the land mammals. Birds lost their place at the top of the food chain, and mammals seized the opportunity to move into the open.
So that gave a big advantage to large size, because if you're out on a plain, out of the forest, out of the protection, if you're big, you can escape predation, you can run faster and get away from the predators.
The changing climate created a new breed of giants,